afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and I am the host of the podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River, and we describe our mission is quite broad. And so sometimes we have individuals who are involved in this area and can talk about what they're doing in the Merrimack River area. Today we have a guest, Bethany Groff Dorau, and welcome, Bethany, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Doug. It's my pleasure.
Bethany is the director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and there are a lot of activities coming up for that organization this spring. But before I get to that, Bethany, you're also much involved in the Newburyport Literary Festival. And let me just ask you a little bit that, how did the festival go? And who were some of the authors that you interacted with or, you felt added, some good content to the festival?
Oh, sure. Thank you for asking me that. Yes, I have been involved with the Literary Festival, I think for almost 10 years now. It started off, I came into during a section, sort of a segment on local history, which turned into New England history, which turned into sort of history. So Glee Woodworth and I, who's another wonderful local historian, we sort of organized one track of history authors. And it was, gosh, what's today? Tuesday? It was Sunday. Seems like it was weeks ago already.
Mm-hmm, it does.
A full day. We had 2 full days, actually 3 days of authors. It's incredible to me that a relatively small community and a relatively small group of people can pull this off. It just seems like such a world-class event. It's just been so, of course, your partner Vicky is just such a wonderful part of this event, as well as your children as well. It's just so that's really a family affair for you. I know my family's gotten involved in it as well. So it was virtual this year, which I think is, it was good for the health and safety of the community for sure. It also allows some access for folks that might not be able to attend in person. I think we definitely miss seeing each other's faces in person, but it was just wonderful. I am at the disadvantage that I'm hosting all day, so I don't get to pop over and see many other authors outside of my own group, but we just had a magnificent time. You were on there with your Plum Island book. And we had A.E. Rooks, who wrote a book called The Black Joke about an anti-slave trade ship, British ship, which is just, she was wonderful fun. She was 9 o'clock in the morning and she was on fire. So that was wonderful to wake up, and see that. There were sessions on the Klondike, on the Tulsa, race riots, just wonderful. And then Glee actually did her wonderful Clipper Heritage Trail, which is a series of local history walks and drives. It was a wonderful, rich, full day.
Well, Glee's was very interesting. Of course, she had a lot of old photos of Newburyport. That was interesting. And then one that you referenced, one of the authors, I think he was from Buffalo, actually, he wrote a book about the gold rush to Alaska, to the Klondike. And there were at least two gold rushes. In 1849, many people went to California. That lasted several decades. He pointed out that the Klondike only lasted for about 4 years. Many people died. It was bad conditions. But, Glee piped up and said, in the California gold rush, many people from Newburyport actually went out west to San Francisco. And I thought that was an interesting aspect to all things gold rushes, because it wasn't just a few, it's quite a few people from Newburyport went out to San Francisco and up north towards Sacramento. So that was an interesting aspect for me.
Oh yeah, so that's Brian Kastner. His book was called Stampede. And I mean, it's just, I can't wait to talk to him more. He just seemed like a very interesting, engaging person. But actually there were quite a number of Newburyporters that went to the Yukon as well. So California, certainly, I think we were a little more familiar with that part of the world because so much of our whaling and shipping now was taking us as Newburyporters out past the West Coast, especially whaling, which now is happening, really off the coast of New Zealand. At this point, we've depleted the Atlantic of their whales. So a lot of Newburyport shipmasters were familiar with California and the West Coast, and it was a pretty easy thing to take a bunch of passengers instead of a bunch of whalers. And then there is, but certainly there were a number of people that went up to the Klondike as well. I think, Brian, the fact that he gave out about the Klondike being 1,000 days was sort of something to hang your hat on. It really wasn't that long.
And one thing he pointed out, which was different than the California, was a lot of people who went to Alaska, they were not seasoned outdoors people. Maybe they couldn't saddle a horse. Maybe they weren't used to trudging through hard climate and deep woods. And I thought that was a good point, because if you went to California, you're going to Sacramento, which is kind of hard. But if you're going to the Yukon, you're really going into a very difficult world. And he had graphic photos of many horses and people who did not make it, who were left along the trail. And so it's quite provocative the way he played it out. And in only 3 or 4 years, that was quite a flash in the pan, if I can use the term.
Absolutely. It is not for the faint of heart, for sure. So no, just every time I come away from the literary festival, just inspired to read so many books and all these wonderful new ideas and all these people that are doing interesting research and writing about it. It's just a gift to have that in our community. I'm very proud to be part of it, even a small part.
Well, several people asked me about next year, because this year was virtual, of course, and in part because it was planned back in September and October, and no one knew at the time. So it was greatly successful virtual. But my understanding is that part of it, at least next year, is going to have what used to be, you'd be in a hall, you'd meet the art, you'd meet the writer, and you might even go to lunch with some people. Do you think you'll have an in-person event next year?
Well, I think the group has to meet. We haven't even had our wrap up from this year yet. So it's sort of a, the planning process is longer. I hope so. Personally, I can speak personally and say, I think there's no substitute for being together with fellow readers, writers, and community members. So I hope there is an element of in-person. I think that these virtual events have really opened the door to a lot of increased participation by folks that either aren't here geographically or aren't mobile in a way that would allow them to come into a hall and hear a lecture. So I hope that we continue with elements of both, but I do hope there's an in-person component.
Well, I'm speaking to Bethany Groff Dorau, and we're talking about the literary festival, but we're versatile people here, and we also want to talk about the Museum of Old Newbury. You've been there about a year as a director. Talk about your first year, if you would, and you got a lot of things done, and just if you can touch on a few things, and then perhaps I could ask you what you have coming up this spring.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. So I'm just shy of a year. I think I started last year at the beginning of June. So I can still say I haven't even been there a year yet when I need to. But I mean, this is an incredible museum. You were talking about the images that Glee had all these images from Old Newbury that illustrate her book and her talk. Well, a lot of those images are from the Museum of Old Newbury. We have one of the best photography collections of photographs of this area. I mean, really, actually, it's a world-class photography collection, full stop. So that's one aspect of what we do. We also have several buildings. So there was, dealing with the challenges of COVID are still challenging. My predecessor did amazing work, sort of getting the museum to a wonderful professional standard. And then COVID hit and everything, things got much more difficult for everyone. So one thing that we're doing, we're opening for tours. We have not been open for tours it would have been almost 3 years. So we are going to be open Thursday through Sunday, starting on that first weekend in June. And we are using people's increased comfort level with buying tickets online, as most people had to do during the pandemic, to sell house tour tickets online. So folks can go right to newburyhistory.org and, reserve some spots to come and see the house. I've spent the last couple of weeks really trying to understand not only the house, the story of the families that lived in the house, but also the story. Unlike some of the other museums I've been involved with, there are many pieces in this museum that you see on a tour that are not necessarily from the house or associated with the families that lived here, but they tell such incredible stories about the history of life in Newbury. Of course, Old Newbury, which is what the museum represents, is now Newbury, Newburyport, and West Newbury.
And
So just
review, if you could, it's on High Street. Is it 99 High Street?
it's
And
98. It's 98 High Street. It's right on the corner of Fruit and High Street.
uh-huh. And it's, a picturesque building. If you folks, most of us go by it. And so I just wanted to remind folks that it's right on High Street, on one of those beautiful parts of High Street. But please continue, Bethany.
Absolutely, it's wonderful. And there is a beautiful garden here as well that has benefited from some wonderful public funds through the Community Preservation Act. And they're open to the public. We hope our community who has helped to preserve these gardens, will come in and enjoy them as well. You can come right through the gate, just close behind you. There's a wonderful landscape here that's open all the time. So that's been open and has really been a sanctuary for many people during the pandemic. But yeah, we are going to be open again for tours. And it's been an extraordinary experience getting to know all of the families whose memory in some way is kept in this place. So yes, the headquarters is the Cushing House, which is at 98 High. And we're looking forward to inviting all of our members and community members back into the museum. So that's going to be very fun. So that starts on June 2nd. That's the first sort of big news. That's the second is that our 43rd annual garden tour is taking place the following, I think it's the following weekend. It's on June 11th and 12th, so Saturday and Sunday, June 11th and 12th, and we have 10 gardens that are available to be toured all across Old Newbury. So 2 in Newbury, 2 in West Newbury, 6 in Newburyport. So folks can come in, they can buy their ticket, they can become a member. And we've got some fun things planned to go along with that as well. But the variety of gardens that cannot be seen outside of this tour are just mind blowing. They're just so wonderful. I just got off the phone before I got on here with you with one of the garden owners who's just over the moon about welcoming people to her garden, which she loves so much and takes such good care of.
Well, one of the things that I've been impressed by from about 2012 till 2017, I was with the Daily News. So I got to, scurry around the community quite a bit. And I found that some of the most remarkable gardens are not seen from the street. Many of the plots, the housing plots in Newburyport are, it has the house out front, but it has quite spacious gardens. And I was intrigued that you'd see what seemed to be a small parcel, and you'd walk around with the owner and you'd see an incredible garden. So I just mentioned this for some of the people who might be interested in going, that, there's a whole different world behind some of these houses. And I would just mention once again, if you're listening, this is Life Along the Merrimack, 96.3 FM Joppa Radio, local channel 9 TV on cable, and it also is archived on YouTube. And maybe you can talk about that. How do you get the owners of the gardens to come forth and, enjoy that day with the many people who come by?
Lots of begging and bribery. No, you're absolutely right that some of the gardens are you just would never, they're unexpected gems. And, once you see them, you are so impressed by what people do, sometimes with quite small spaces. And that's part of the fun, is that we have a real variety. We have a homesteader garden, we have sort of a grand estate garden, and then we have some pocket gardens in the south end of Newburyport that are, little sort of smaller, some with formal plantings, some with much more like a cottage garden. I think there's something for everyone, and there are a lot of wonderful creative people doing incredible things with a variety of different kinds of gardens. So that's really fun. So it's funny, it's been kind of an organic process. People have turned their neighbors in. They've they've sort of suggested that they have somebody, they know someone with a garden that might be interested in it. It's the biggest fundraiser of the year for the museum. So some people really do this because they want to support the museum and the work we do here. And that is, of course, much appreciated. Sometimes we get a contact from a person, a landscape architect or a gardener who's been working very hard on a project. And of course, they're very excited to showcase their work. So it really it comes in a variety of ways, but it's always a little bit of a nail biter. You know, you're always wondering, because each year it sort of comes together organically, and then you have the characteristic of that year set by whoever came together in that way. So sometimes people are invited, sometimes people volunteer, sometimes people are suggested, but we're always looking for gardens for next year and the year after. I don't see this stopping anytime soon. It's just a wonderful community event.
You know, you've done a lot. You're continuing with this tour, and you've done a lot in your first year. I think you've also initiated or keep up a blog. And I mentioned that on your website because you come out with a lot of unusual elements to the community and a lot of things that people wouldn't ordinarily know. How did you start writing your blog? And, you know, what are a couple of the subjects that you've looked into? Because, you know, now that we have a diminishing element of the local newspaper, I can say that because I used to work there, but I enjoy reading your blog because it has a lot of historical elements. And maybe you could talk a little about what you look for.
You know, it's funny. I think you probably know this based on the work that you do, but things find you. You know, I come from a family that's been in Newbury since 1635. I have my mother's side of the family has very, very deep roots in the community. And I live in the house that was built by my great, great, great grandfather, Ebenezer Poor, in 1817. I mean, I myself have a real connection with this community. But what I find is that it just in the course of my everyday life, I keep stumbling across things that I want to learn more about. And in some ways, the blog is an excuse for me to set aside the time and do a little bit more research on a thing. You know, the connections just sort of happen naturally. I hope they continue to happen because, you know, I need to come up with one of these every week or two. But so far, it's just been a joy. I started off, before I ever worked here or intended to work here, I was a guest blogger for the newsletter during COVID, which gave me an opportunity to do some writing and research. And I think when you think historically about your life, which a lot of people do, I want everyone to, because it's so interesting, you're always looking at a thing and thinking, I wonder where that came from, or I wonder what the history of that thing is, especially in a place like Newburyport where it's all around you. And, you know, I find that for me, I am, you know, it sounds a little morbid, but I love going to a burying ground and just, you know, trying to figure out who these people were and why they left the message that they left to posterity on their headstone. And then I can go back. We have such incredible records in this part of the world. You can look up someone's death record, their birth record, their marriage record. You can figure out how they lived, where they lived. So it's really, and sometimes the topics that come up and bite me are really, you know, weird or sort
Such as what?
I got very interested in the idea that people they didn't sleep all night. They slept in shifts, but, you know, pre-industrial humans tended to sleep. They'd sleep when the sun went down and then they'd get up sort of in the middle of the night and spend a couple hours doing all sorts of things and then go back to sleep and wake up at dawn, you know, in the winter where there's many, many, many long hours of darkness. And I got very interested in what was happening between sort of, you know, midnight and 3 a.m. when people would get up and do whatever. And I started thinking about that. I was up myself one night and thought, you know, I wonder what it would be like to live like that. And then started looking around Newbury records to see if there are any records of people talking about what they did. And we did actually find some records of people saying, you know, I slaughtered a hog at midnight. Well, you didn't really. I mean, maybe the hog was asleep and easier to catch. I don't know, but there was a there were a lot of court cases that referenced, somebody going to someone's house at midnight to have a smoke, which would have been totally normal behavior. That wasn't the remarkable piece of it. But then what happened subsequently became the story. So things like that, how did people sleep? How did people, how many people had pear trees versus apple trees? I think about that when I look out my window. What were people eating? How were they eating? How did they deal with childbirth, loss? What are the meaning of some of the objects that you see? There's an 11-foot gun upstairs at the museum. I'm right now looking into that. It has a very interesting.
To fire it, or just to clean it, or where?
I'm going nowhere near it with anything explosive. I'm sure it would blow my ear off, but.
Well, one of the most interesting things that I've seen in Newburyport, and this is the long form, was when you discovered that a young Newburyport guy went to World War I. His name is Eben Bradbury. I don't say you stumbled on it, but you came upon it. You wrote a wonderful book about it, came out several years ago. You talked to local people. I think you eventually found out that your family was connected to the Bradbury family. Can you talk about how you discovered Eben Bradbury and how you pushed forward on it?
I would be happy to. And I have to say, the Museum of Old Newbury had a lot to do with that process. This is one of the first places that I came when my interest was piqued by Eben. So I did stumble across it. I was writing a history of a battle, a World War I battle called Bella Wood, where there was a horrible slaughter of Marines. And I happened to be driving down Pond Street, down behind the George Washington statue, and looked over and read that big rock that's there, really for the first time, I think, knowing what it said. And it said, dedicated to Eben Bradbury, killed in the Battle of Bella Wood. And I just felt like, my heart started pounding. I felt like I knew exactly what this poor, young man had been through, or at least I knew what his peers had been through. So I started doing some research. I stumbled across another relative of his. He gave me a medal that he was going to give to Eben in France. He couldn't go to France. I took it to France. So I've been to France to visit his grave several times. And of course, that's very meaningful to me. So I had to do a little bit of research to get his military record. Actually, that was a very important part of the process. And in order to do that, I had to prove that I was related to him. And so I did my genealogy, and my mother is his fifth cousin. I'm his, I guess, fifth cousin. No, I'm lying. My mother is his fourth cousin, 3 times removed, and I am his fourth cousin, 4 times removed. So I was able to get his records.
I'll have to write that down when I get the opportunity.
I know, it's funny.
But it seemed, you had wonderful correspondence there from both sides, and it just seemed like he was a young guy, 18 to 19 perhaps.
Yeah,
but
he had just turned 20, just
20.
barely 20.
He seemed intrigued by the whole, and I'll call it an adventure, although it's unfortunate it ended in his death. But probably a lot of young people felt that way before many people had cars, before there were planes. It seemed like a big adventure. And for a while, I think he was quite excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was we hadn't been at war in a really profound way since the Civil War. So a generation had passed that had not themselves been directly involved in a major war. Of course, there was the Spanish-American War and various other conflicts, but, I think he was a young man. He had just finished a postgraduate year of high school. He actually came back to Newburyport High and did a second senior year. And he was at a bit of a loose end. I mean, I think we all know kids that this happens to, where they're trying to figure out what to do next. And then voila, here's a way to go to war, make some money. It was a next thing for him to do. I think he was probably drawn to the sense of adventure. He spoke to the high school and said some really, stirring patriotic things. How much of that was, edited for effect is I'll leave that to the newspaper man to say. But, I think it was who knows why people make the complicated decisions that they make. But I think it's fair to say that he believed that he was following in the footsteps of other Newburyport men and women who had served their country.
So if you're listening, this is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, hosting the podcast. Bethany Groff Dorau is my guest. We're on 96.3 Joppa Radio, Channel 9, local cable, and we're also streaming and archived on YouTube. So it's really interesting, many of the things that you've done, and I wonder, we're coming to the end of our moment, but can you just review, give your website for the folks and talk a little about the tour again? You can tour the building itself at 98 High Street, and you have a garden tour. If you can just review that, that would be helpful.
I would be happy to. So on May 26th, we have a lecture here at the museum. That's our next big event. The horticulturalist from the Crane Estate, which is a trustees of reservations property, will be coming to talk to us about the work that's being done at the Crane Estate. So the Castle Hill Gardens. It should be a wonderful talk. It's here at the museum. And you can buy tickets to that or any of our events, and also actually see my blog at Newbury History, NEWBURY history.org. That's our website. Of course, the garden tour is on June 11th and 12th. And we open for house tours Thursday through Sunday, starting on June 2nd.
So that's terrific. I'm looking forward to the tour because, as I said, there are many hidden gardens here. And just a word, if you would, about the Cushing House, the building that you're in on High Street. Caleb Cushing was a true luminary, it strikes me. Newburyport's first mayor. He was a big shot in national politics as well. Are there many books, because we started talking about books, are there many books on Caleb Cushing? Because he's one of the most prominent Newburyporters, and I'm just intrigued by his story.
He has a fascinating story. He was a very important politician. He was a very important diplomat as well. He helped to negotiate the first trade agreement with China. He was almost the Supreme Justice, or the Justice of the Supreme Court, the head justice. Now I've forgotten what that's called, but at any rate, he was nominated for that. And his nomination was withdrawn in part because he had a problematic friendship with Jefferson Davis, who had been the Secretary of War when he was Attorney General. And he had never been, he was not pro-slavery, but he was never anti-slavery. He thought it was a states' rights issue and had opposed efforts to abolish, on a federal level, to abolish slavery. And so he didn't come out of the Civil War looking like roses. It really hurt his long-term reputation. And it's something that we tell that story honestly, and we are as open about that as we can be, while still really celebrating a lot of the contributions he made to the diplomatic and political life of this country. He was Newburyport's first mayor. He, again, was very important in diplomatic relations with China, Spain. And he was an intelligent, well-read person. There's not a whole lot of scholarship currently about him. Again, I think he's sort of fallen out of favor as a subject because of his very problematic political standpoint. But he's an interesting figure nonetheless, and he certainly is part of the life and the history of Newburyport, and he's part of the exploring of Newburyport's complicated, not always, pretty past. He certainly was not alone in his beliefs, and I think it's important that we talk about those things as openly as we talk about the things that we think of as inspiring and attractive.
Well, on that note, William Lloyd Garrison, another icon in Newburyport history, had times when he wasn't so popular here in Newburyport because he was very much an abolitionist. And I think in 1838, he was going to give a two-night presentation because he was a journalist and a writer. And after his first night, they asked him not to come back because a lot of people were making money from the slave trade, as you know, Bethany. And
Absolutely.
So I think there were mixed feelings about his very strong stand. Well, we could talk about this all day, as the expression goes, but it's
Absolutely.
just about 2:30. Bethany Groff Dorau, who's head of the Museum of Old Newbury, has been speaking with us. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. That'll do it for us today. And again, Bethany, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Dyke.
Bye-bye.